Let's get started. Story number 1.
It's written to immerse you in its eerie atmosphere and unsettling events. Sit tight and prepare for a spine-tingling ride. It started as a normal autumn evening. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a patchwork of dark blue and orange streaks. The roads were empty, lined with towering oaks whose skeletal branches scratched at the sky like desperate hands. Emily had been driving for hours, the rhythmic hum of the tires on asphalt the only sound keeping her company. She was heading home after a weekend visiting her mother in a small town 2 states away. Her GPS told her to take the scenic route, a winding road cutting through dense woods. She hesitated but reasoned it was a shorter drive and she wanted to be home before midnight. The first hour on the forest road was uneventful. Emily sang along to her favorite playlist, tapping her fingers on the steering wheel. The trees on either side of the road seemed to close in, their dark silhouettes casting shifting shadows that danced across her windshield. It was just past 10 p.m. when her phone buzzed with a notification. Emily glanced at it. Weak signal. GPS rerouting. She sighed. The road ahead curved sharply, and for the first time she noticed how eerily quiet it was. No chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, just silence. She tightened her grip on the wheel, brushing it off as her overactive imagination. The headlights illuminated a faded wooden sign. Welcome to Ashmere Hollow. Emily frowned. She didn't remember seeing this name on her map earlier. Minutes later, she caught movement on the road ahead. A figure stood in the middle of the lane, silhouetted by her high beams. Emily slammed on the brakes, her heart hammering in her chest. It was a woman, barefoot and wearing a tattered white dress that looked like it had seen better days. Her hair was long and wild, hanging in messy tangles that obscured most of her face. She didn't move, didn't flinch. Emily rolled down her window slightly. "Are you okay?" she called out, her voice trembling. The woman tilted her head slowly, like she didn't understand the question. Then she lifted her arm and pointed down the road. Something about the way she moved sent a shiver through Emily. It wasn't natural, too stiff, too deliberate. Emily's instincts screamed at her to drive away, but she hesitated. What if the woman was lost or hurt? The woman's arm dropped, and she turned, walking off the road and vanishing into the woods without a word. Emily stared after her, her pulse racing. "Just keep driving," she muttered to herself, forcing her foot back on the accelerator. But as the car moved forward, Emily noticed something in the rearview mirror. The woman was now standing behind her car, perfectly still, illuminated by the red glow of the taillights. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She pressed harder on the gas, the car lurching forward. When she dared glance in the mirror again, the woman was gone. The forest seemed darker now, the trees denser. The road narrowed, and Emily realized she hadn't seen another car for miles. The uneasy feeling in her stomach grew. Suddenly, the radio crackled, the music cutting out. Static filled the car, sharp and grating. Emily fiddled with the dial, trying to fix it, but it wouldn't stop. Then, through the static, she heard something faint, like a voice. "Help me," Emily froze. The voice was faint, distorted, but unmistakable. She turned off the radio entirely, her hands trembling. "Just my imagination," she whispered, trying to convince herself. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. A sharp knock on the passenger window made her scream. She slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt. There was no one there. Emily's chest heaved as she looked around, her eyes darting to every shadow, every movement. The woods pressed closer, the darkness suffocating. She locked the doors and started driving again, faster this time. Her headlights caught something ahead, a house. It was old, its paint peeling, with broken windows and a sagging porch. The front door was ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze. She didn't want to stop, but the road curved sharply around the property, and she had no choice but to slow down. As she passed, she glanced at the house. A face stared back at her from one of the upstairs windows. Emily screamed and pressed the gas pedal to the floor, her car roaring down the road. She didn't care where the GPS was leading her anymore. She just wanted to get out of the woods. The road twisted and turned, the trees blurring past. Emily's heart raced as she spotted something ahead, a figure standing in the middle of the road again. It was the woman in the white dress. Emily swerved, narrowly missing her. The car veered off the road, the tires skidding on loose gravel. She fought to regain control, the car coming to a stop inches from a massive tree. Her hands shook as she tried to restart the engine. It sputtered, refusing to turn over. Come on, she begged, glancing in the mirrors. The woman was nowhere to be seen, but Emily didn't trust it. The engine roared to life, and she slammed it into gear. But as she pulled back onto the road, she felt it, a weight in the back seat. Her blood ran cold. She didn't dare look in the rearview mirror. Keep driving, she told herself, her voice barely a whisper. Just keep driving. But she couldn't resist. Her eyes flicked to the mirror. The woman was sitting in the back seat, her hollow eyes locked on Emily's. Her mouth twisted into a wide, unnatural grin, and she whispered a single word. Stop. Emily screamed, the car swerving wildly. She slammed on the brakes, the vehicle skidding to a halt in the middle of the road. She flung open the door and stumbled out, gasping for air. The car sat silent, its engine idling. The back seat was empty. Emily spun around, searching the darkness. The woman was gone. For a moment, everything was still. Then, from the woods, she heard it. A laugh. Low and guttural, it echoed through the trees, growing louder and louder. Emily didn't wait. She jumped back into the car, locked the doors, and sped down the road, her hands gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The laugh followed her, fading only when she saw the first glimmers of headlights in the distance. She didn't stop until she reached a gas station miles away. The bright fluorescent lights, a welcome relief. The attendant gave her a strange look as she stumbled inside, pale and shaking. You look like you've seen a ghost, he said with a nervous chuckle. Emily didn't respond. She just bought a coffee, sat in her car under the station's lights, and waited until dawn before driving the rest of the way home. She never took the scenic route again. Story the end?
Story number 2.
It was late October when Angela set out on her trip to her grandparents' house, deep in the Appalachian foothills. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, and a light mist was rising from the damp roads. Angela preferred driving at night. Less traffic and the calmness of the dark countryside roads usually helped clear her mind. She had taken this route dozens of times before, a mix of highways and winding back roads. Tonight, though, her GPS offered an alternative, a shorter route through a road named Hollow Creek Trail. It wasn't on her usual map, but she figured a shortcut wouldn't hurt. The road name sounded quaint, and Angela had a fondness for exploring paths less traveled. The first 10 miles of Hollow Creek Trail were uneventful. The road was narrow, the asphalt cracked in places, but it was manageable. On either side, the dense forest seemed to stretch endlessly. Her headlights caught glimpses of skeletal branches swaying in the breeze, their shadows clawing at the edges of the road. She turned up her music to drown out the eerie quiet. The hum of her car and the upbeat tunes helped steady her nerves. But as she drove deeper, the signal on her phone began to falter. First, her GPS froze, and then her music app went silent. She groaned in frustration and fiddled with the device. "Great, no service," she muttered, glancing at the screen. The little spinning icon was the only sign of life. The road seemed darker now, the trees pressed closer, their twisted forms looming like silent sentinels. She felt a pang of unease, but brushed it off. It was just a road, she told herself. She'd be back on the main route soon enough. 15 minutes passed, and Angela noticed something strange. She hadn't seen another car, not a single pair of headlights in either direction. Normally, even on back roads, there was the occasional truck or wandering vehicle. But here, it was as though the world had emptied. And then she saw the hitchhiker. He appeared suddenly, illuminated by her high beams. A young man, perhaps in his mid-20s, standing on the shoulder of the road. His clothes were damp and rumpled, his hair plastered to his forehead. He was waving one hand, signaling her to stop. Angela hesitated. Picking up strangers wasn't something she did, but there was something desperate about him. Maybe his car had broken down. Maybe he needed help. She slowed and rolled down her window, keeping the doors locked. "Hey, are you okay?" The man nodded, his expression a mix of relief and exhaustion. "Yeah, my car's back there. Battery's dead. I've been walking for hours." His voice was hoarse, and Angela noticed how pale he looked, almost sickly. "Do you need a ride to the nearest town?" she offered. "Yes, please. If it's not too much trouble," he replied, his voice cracking slightly. She unlocked the passenger door, and he climbed in, shivering as he rubbed his hands together. "Thank you. I wasn't sure if anyone would come by. Angela smiled politely, though unease prickled at her. It's no problem. What were you doing out here? There's not much around. I was heading to my cousin's place, he said, glancing nervously out the window. Took a wrong turn, I guess. My car gave out, and I've been stuck ever since. As they drove, Angela tried to make small talk, but the man gave short, clipped answers. His eyes darted around the dark road, and his hands fidgeted in his lap. Something about him felt off, but Angela couldn't pinpoint what. After a few minutes, she noticed something strange. The temperature in the car had dropped significantly. She glanced at the dashboard, but the heat was still on. You cold? She asked, trying to sound casual. The man didn't respond. He was staring straight ahead, his jaw tight. Hey, she tried again, louder this time. Slowly, he turned to her. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. We have to get out of here. Angela's grip on the wheel tightened. What are you talking about? They're coming, he whispered, his voice trembling. Who's coming? She demanded, her heart pounding. Before he could answer, the car's radio crackled to life. Static filled the cabin, loud and grating. Angela reached for the dial to turn it off, but the static abruptly stopped. A woman's voice came through, faint but clear. You shouldn't have stopped. Angela froze. The voice didn't belong to any radio host. It was soft, cold, and unsettlingly close, as if the speaker were right there in the car with them. The hitchhiker's breathing quickened. You need to drive faster, he urged, his voice rising. Angela pressed the gas, her pulse racing. The car surged forward, but the unease in her chest grew heavier. The road stretched endlessly ahead, and the forest seemed darker than before. Angela glanced in her rearview mirror, and her blood ran cold. There was a figure in the back seat. A woman, her face obscured by long, wet hair, sat silently behind them. Her head was tilted to the side, and her pale hands rested in her lap. Angela screamed, slamming the brakes. The car skidded to a halt, and she spun around to confront the back seat. It was empty. The hitchhiker grabbed her arm. Don't stop, he yelled. You have to keep going. Angela's heart hammered in her chest, but she threw the car back into gear and sped forward. The forest blurred around them, the shadows seeming to twist and writhe. What the hell is going on? She shouted. They don't like when people stop, the man said, his voice shaking. They follow you. The car jolted violently, as if something had slammed into it from the side. Angela struggled to keep control of the wheel, her knuckles white as she gripped it tightly. A low, guttural noise filled the air, echoing through the car. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was something else entirely. Angela's vision blurred with tears as she pushed the car to its limits, the engine roaring. The hitchhiker was muttering something under his breath, words she couldn't understand. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The temperature in the car began to rise, and the shadows outside seemed to retreat. The road widened, and Angela saw the faint glow of streetlights ahead. She didn't slow down until they reached the outskirts of a small town. She pulled into the parking lot of a gas station and cut the engine, her hands shaking. The hitchhiker sat beside her, his head in his hands. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Finally, Angela broke the silence. What? What was that? The man looked at her, his eyes hollow. You don't want to know. Before she could respond, he opened the door and stepped out. He didn't thank her, didn't say goodbye. He just walked away, disappearing into the shadows. Angela sat there for a long time, trying to make sense of what had happened. Eventually, she drove the rest of the way to her grandparents' house, but she never took Hollow Creek Trail again. Months later, curiosity got the better of her. She searched for information about the road, but found nothing, no mention of it on maps, no records of its existence. It was as if the road had never been there at all. But Angela knew better. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The rain had been falling steadily since late afternoon, turning the roads slick and the air heavy with the smell of wet earth. Daniel had just wrapped up a late shift at the hospital and was heading home to his small town 2 hours away. The clock on the dashboard read 11:23 p.m., and the rhythmic drumming of the rain on the windshield was starting to make him drowsy. He turned up the volume on the radio, but static greeted him instead of music. With a sigh, he twisted the knob, trying to find a station, but the interference persisted. Figures, he muttered, glancing out at the empty highway. His GPS had rerouted him earlier due to a road closure, sending him down a stretch of unfamiliar back roads. The direction seemed straightforward enough. A right turn here, a left there, and he'd be back on track. But as the minutes ticked by and the road narrowed, Daniel began to feel uneasy. The dense forest on either side of the road loomed, the trees' gnarled branches casting eerie shadows under his headlights. He hadn't seen another car in over half an hour, and the only sound was the steady thrum of his engine and the occasional splash of his tires cutting through puddles. Then, up ahead, his headlights caught a figure standing at the edge of the road. Daniel slowed instinctively, squinting to get a better look. It was a woman, drenched from head to toe, her hair plastered to her face. She wore what looked like an old-fashioned dress, the kind you might see in black and white photographs, and she was waving her arm. "Are you kidding me?" he mumbled under his breath, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. Picking up hitchhikers was something he'd always sworn he'd never do, especially not in the middle of nowhere on a rainy night. But as he drew closer, the woman's desperate expression gave him pause. Her lips were moving, though he couldn't hear her over the rain. She looked terrified. Against his better judgment, Daniel pulled over and rolled down the passenger side window just a crack. "Are you okay?" he called out. The woman leaned toward the car, her hands trembling. "Please, can you help me? My car, it broke down, and I don't know what to do." Her voice was shaky, barely audible over the rain. Daniel hesitated, glancing past her into the darkness. "Where's your car?" She pointed vaguely down the road behind her. "Just a little ways back. Please, I can't stay out here." Something about her didn't sit right with him. Her dress looked old, not just in style but in condition, frayed at the edges, the fabric dull and worn. And her shoes, if you could call them that, looked like they belonged to another century. But her wide, pleading eyes pulled at his conscience. "All right," he said reluctantly. "Get in. I'll drive you to the nearest gas station." The woman opened the door and slid into the passenger seat without a word. The smell of damp earth and something faintly metallic filled the car. Daniel tried to ignore it as he pulled back onto the road. They drove in silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the swish of the windshield wipers and the patter of rain. Daniel glanced at her out of the corner of his eye. She was staring straight ahead, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "What were you doing out here so late?" he asked, trying to break the tension. "I was visiting someone," she said hesitantly, her voice soft. "Someone who lives around here?" She didn't answer right away. "Not anymore." Daniel frowned, but didn't press further. The unease in his chest was growing. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. After another few minutes, the woman suddenly turned to him. "You shouldn't have stopped," she said, her voice low. Daniel's grip on the wheel tightened. "What do you mean?" She didn't answer, her gaze shifting back to the road ahead. Before he could ask again, the radio crackled to life, filling the car with static. Daniel jumped, his hand instinctively going to the dial to turn it off. But as he reached for it, a voice emerged from the static, faint, distorted, and chilling. "Turn back," it said. Daniel's heart raced. He turned the knob furiously, but the static wouldn't stop. The voice repeated itself, clearer this time. "Turn back." He glanced at the woman, but she didn't seem fazed. She sat perfectly still, her expression blank. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded, his voice trembling. The woman turned to him again, her eyes dark and unblinking. "They're coming," she said simply. Daniel's pulse quickened. "Who's coming?" She didn't answer. Suddenly, the car jolted as though something had struck it from behind. Daniel slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, but there was nothing there. No animals, no debris. He twisted in his seat to look behind him, but the rear window was fogged up. He wiped at it with his sleeve, his breath catching in his throat. Through the mist, he saw them. Figures, dozens of them, standing in the road behind the car. They were barely visible in the rain, their outlines hazy and shifting, but they were unmistakably human. "Drive," the woman said, her voice suddenly sharp. Daniel didn't need to be told twice. He slammed his foot on the gas, the tires spinning briefly before finding traction. The car surged forward, and the figures disappeared into the darkness. "What the hell were those?" he shouted, panic lacing his words. "They're not supposed to let you leave," the woman said quietly. "What are you talking about?" She didn't respond. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the rain intensifying. Daniel glanced at the GPS, but the screen was blank. No signal, no map, nothing. The woman suddenly leaned forward, pointing. "Turn here." He hesitated. There was no visible road, just a narrow dirt path cutting into the trees. "Are you sure?" "Turn," she shouted, her voice echoing unnaturally in the small cabin. Daniel swerved onto the path, the car bouncing over the uneven terrain. The headlights barely illuminated the way, but the figures were gone. For now. The woman slumped back into her seat, her breathing shallow. "Where are we going?" Daniel asked, his voice shaking. "You'll see," she said, her tone eerily calm. The path wound through the forest, the trees pressing closer and closer until it felt like they were driving through a tunnel. The air grew colder and the metallic smell intensified. Finally, the path opened up into a small clearing. In the center stood a dilapidated house, its windows shattered, the roof sagging. The sight of it sent a shiver down Daniel's spine. "What is this place?" he asked, but the woman was already opening the door. "Wait," he called after her, but she was gone, disappearing into the rain. Daniel sat there, his hands gripping the wheel, his heart pounding. He didn't want to follow her, but he couldn't just leave her there. Taking a deep breath, he grabbed his phone and stepped out into the rain. The air was icy, each drop cutting into his skin. "Hello," he called out, his voice barely carrying over the storm. The front door of the house creaked open, and he hesitated. Against every instinct, he stepped inside. The interior was dark, the air thick with the smell of mold and decay. "Hello," he called again. A faint sound came from upstairs, a woman's voice, humming a haunting melody. Daniel's blood ran cold. He turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind him, plunging the room into darkness. Story the end.
Story number 4.
It started with the storm. A swirling mess of wind and rain had knocked out power across the small town of Willow Creek one October evening. The roads were slick, illuminated only by the occasional flicker of lightning. Tom Clarkson was driving back from his sister's place, a good 30 miles away, taking a less traveled back road to avoid the highway traffic. His GPS struggled to maintain its connection, flashing in and out as the storm raged on. The road was unfamiliar, narrow, flanked by towering trees whose bare branches clawed at the sky like skeletal hands. The rain smacked against the windshield in relentless sheets, and Tom cursed under his breath, squinting to see the faded lines on the road. A sign suddenly loomed ahead, worn and barely legible, Whispering Pines Cemetery, established 1823. Tom shivered, though the car heater hummed steadily. He'd heard stories about this place, a graveyard notorious for strange occurrences. Missing hikers, muffled whispers in the woods, shadowy figures glimpsed through the trees. But those were just rumors, urban legends. As he passed the entrance to the cemetery, his headlights caught movement. A figure standing motionless just beyond the wrought iron gate. A woman, her pale dress clinging to her frame in the rain, her dark hair plastered to her face. Tom's heart jumped. What was someone doing out here in this weather? He slowed the car to a crawl, rolling down the passenger window just enough to call out, "Hey, are you okay?" The woman didn't move. She stared at him, her face obscured by her soaked hair, and Tom felt an odd chill creep over him. Something was off. Her stillness. The way the rain seemed to fall around her, leaving her untouched. "Do you need a ride?" He tried again. Uneasy but unable to drive off and leave her there. This time she moved, slowly turning her head to look directly at him. Her eyes were unnervingly dark, as if the pupils had swallowed the irises entirely. Tom's stomach twisted, and before he realized what he was doing, his foot pressed the gas pedal. The car sped forward, and the figure disappeared in his rearview mirror. "Just a trick of the light," he muttered to himself, gripping the wheel tighter. "I'm imagining things." But the unease didn't leave him. The road stretched on, the forest thickening on either side. His GPS sputtered back to life briefly, directing him to take a left turn ahead. But as he reached the turn, he hesitated. The road wasn't paved, just gravel and mud, slick with rain. The GPS insisted, though, and Tom, not wanting to backtrack in the storm, reluctantly turned onto it. The tires crunched over loose gravel, the rain muting the sound. The woods seemed to close in, the trees pressing closer to the road. His high beams barely pierced the darkness, casting strange, shifting shadows. And then he saw her again. The woman. She stood in the middle of the road this time, her back to him, her wet dress hanging heavily. Tom slammed on the brakes, the car skidding slightly before stopping mere feet from her. His heart pounded as he stared. How had she gotten here? There were no side paths, no shortcuts she could have taken to beat him here. This close, he could see the fabric of her dress was old, fraying at the edges. She didn't turn, didn't acknowledge the car idling behind her. Tom's hand hovered over the horn, but something stopped him. A deep, instinctual fear. Suddenly she began to walk. Not away from the car, but toward it, her movements jerky, unnatural. Her head tilted slightly to one side as she came closer, and Tom felt a scream clawing its way up his throat. He slammed the car into reverse, tires slipping in the mud, and backed up as fast as he dared. The woman broke into a run. Her legs didn't bend as they should. Her arms flailed unnaturally, as if her joints were dislocated. Tom floored it, skidding backward until the rear tires hit solid ground. He spun the wheel, forcing the car back onto the paved road, and didn't look back. The rain began to let up as he neared the edge of town. His GPS finally steadied, rerouting him to a different road. He exhaled shakily, trying to convince himself that he'd imagined it all. The storm, the darkness, they'd played tricks on his mind. Tom pulled into the gas station on the outskirts of town, needing a break. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly as he grabbed a cup of coffee, his hand still trembling. The clerk, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, gave him a curious look. "You all right, buddy?" Tom hesitated, debating whether to say anything. "Yeah, just a weird drive. I think I saw someone out by Whispering Pines." The clerk's expression changed, his face paling. "You said Whispering Pines?" Tom nodded. The clerk leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "You didn't pick her up, did you?" "What? No. Why?" The man sighed, glancing around as if to make sure no one else was listening. "They call her the Bride of Whispering Pines. She was killed on her wedding day, carriage accident, back in the 1800s. People say she haunts those woods, looking for someone to take her home." Tom felt a cold sweat break out on his skin. "That's just a story, right?" The clerk didn't smile. "Plenty of folks have seen her. Most don't make it far if they stop. If you're here, you're lucky, real lucky." Tom left the gas station in a daze, the coffee untouched in his hand. As he got back into the car, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was still being watched. He glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her face staring back at him. But the back seat was empty. The rain had stopped entirely by the time he pulled into his driveway. The house was dark, the power still out, but Tom didn't care. He was just relieved to be home. He locked the car and hurried inside, slamming the door behind him. As he fumbled for his phone to use as a flashlight, a faint sound reached his ears, a soft, rhythmic dripping. He froze, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. The sound wasn't coming from outside, it was inside the house. Slowly, Tom turned toward the living room. The dim light from his phone barely illuminated the space, but it was enough. Enough to see the trail of wet footprints leading from the front door to the center of the room. And there she stood. Her dress still clung to her, though no water pooled beneath her feet. Her dark eyes locked onto his, her lips curling into a cold, hollow smile. Tom opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The lights flickered once, twice, and then died completely.
Story the end.
Story number 5.
It was supposed to be a simple drive. Jess had left her sister's house in the next state over after dinner, hoping to make it home before midnight. The drive was familiar. She'd taken this route countless times over the years. But tonight, the highway was undergoing construction, forcing her to take a detour through the rural backroads that twisted and turned through dense woods and desolate fields. The clock on her dashboard read 10:43 p.m. The rain had started about an hour ago, light at first, but now coming down in heavy sheets. Jess gripped the steering wheel tighter as her old sedan hydroplaned slightly on the slick road. The windshield wipers squealed as they worked overtime, but visibility was still terrible. The high beams reflected off the rain, making the road ahead look like a blurry mirage. She turned the radio off. The static had been irritating, and she'd lost her favorite station somewhere in the middle of nowhere. The silence was deafening, except for the wipers and the hum of her engine. It wasn't like her to get spooked, but something about driving alone in the middle of a storm made her stomach twist. The GPS app on her phone had rerouted her down an unfamiliar road. It was narrow, winding, and lined with trees so tall and close together that they formed a canopy overhead. Jess checked her phone mounted on the dashboard, the blue line reassuring her she was on track. Another 45 minutes to go. She sighed and rolled her shoulders, trying to shake the tension building in her body. The first sign of trouble came just as she rounded a sharp bend. Her headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. Jess gasped and slammed on the brakes, the car skidding slightly before coming to a halt a few yards away from the person. Her heart raced as she tried to process what she was seeing. It was a woman, standing completely still, her hair plastered to her face from the rain. She wore a pale dress that clung to her body, the fabric tattered and stained with mud. Jess leaned forward, squinting through the rain. The woman wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at the car. Jess hesitated, her fingers hovering over the door lock button. Something about the woman didn't feel right. Her posture was rigid, unnatural, and her face was expressionless, almost blank. She reached for her phone to call for help, but realized she had no signal. Of course not. She was in the middle of nowhere. Taking a deep breath, Jess rolled down her window just enough to shout over the rain. "Are you okay?" she called, her voice trembling. The woman didn't respond. She didn't even flinch. Jess's instincts screamed at her to keep driving, but she couldn't just leave someone standing in the middle of the road. Swallowing her fear, she rolled the window down a bit more. "Do you need help?" she asked again. This time, the woman moved. Slowly, she lifted an arm and pointed to the side of the road toward the trees. Jess followed the direction of her finger but saw nothing except darkness. "What is it?" Jess asked, her voice shaking. "Is someone over there?" The woman didn't answer. She just kept pointing. Jess's chest tightened. She didn't know what to do. Her gut told her to drive away, but her conscience gnawed at her. What if someone was hurt? What if this woman was in trouble? She made her decision quickly, rolling up the window and grabbing the flashlight from her glove compartment. She turned off the engine and stepped out into the rain, the cold droplets immediately soaking through her jacket. The air was thick and heavy, the kind of dampness that clung to your skin. "Hello?" Jess called out, shining the flashlight toward the trees. "Is someone there?" The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but tree trunks and undergrowth. Jess turned back to the woman, but her breath caught in her throat. The woman was gone. Panic surged through Jess as she scanned the road and the surrounding woods. There was no sign of her, not a shadow, not a sound. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Jess's heartbeat thundered in her ears. She stumbled back to her car, fumbling with the door handle. She climbed inside, locking the doors and gripping the steering wheel tightly. Her chest rose and fell as she tried to calm herself. "This is insane," she muttered, glancing in the rearview mirror. "Just keep driving. You're almost home." She started the engine and pulled back onto the road, her tires splashing through the puddles. The headlights illuminated the path ahead, but Jess couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced in the rearview mirror again, half expecting to see the woman standing behind her car. The road twisted and turned, the rain continuing to pound against the windshield. Jess kept her eyes fixed ahead, her hands gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She just needed to get back to the main highway. Everything would be fine once she was back in familiar territory. And then, out of nowhere, her car radio crackled to life. Jess jumped, her heart lurching in her chest. Static filled the cabin, loud and jarring against the silence. She reached for the knob to turn it off, but as her fingers brushed the dial, a voice emerged from the static. "Help me." Jess froze. The voice was faint, distorted, but it was unmistakably a woman's. She stared at the radio, her hand trembling. "What the hell?" she whispered. The voice came again, louder this time. "Help me, please." Jess's breath hitched. She yanked her hand away from the radio as if it had burned her. The static faded, leaving only the sound of the rain and her own ragged breathing. Her phone buzzed in the cup holder, startling her. She grabbed it, relieved to see she finally had a signal. But the relief was short-lived. The notification wasn't a call or a text. It was a weather alert. Flash flood warning in your area. Avoid low-lying roads. Jess cursed under her breath, tossing the phone back into the cup holder. She had no choice but to keep going. Turning back wasn't an option. The road ahead dipped into a shallow valley, and Jess's stomach sank as she saw water pooling across the asphalt. She slowed the car, her headlights reflecting off the murky surface. It didn't look deep, but she knew how deceptive floodwaters could be. As she debated whether to drive through or turn around, movement in her peripheral vision caught her attention. She turned her head, her blood running cold. The woman was back. She stood on the side of the road, her soaked dress clinging to her frame. But this time she wasn't alone. Behind her, barely visible in the shadows, were other figures. They stood silently, their faces obscured by the rain, their outlines blurred. Jess's heart pounded as she realized there were at least half a dozen of them, all watching her. She slammed her foot on the gas, her tires skidding slightly as the car surged forward into the flooded road. The water splashed up around her, but she didn't care. She just needed to get away. The figures disappeared in her rearview mirror, but Jess didn't slow down. Her hands shook as she gripped the wheel, her eyes darting between the road and the mirrors. She felt like she couldn't breathe, like the air in the car had turned to ice. When she finally saw the lights of a small diner up ahead, she let out a shaky breath. She pulled into the parking lot and parked as close to the building as possible. The rain had eased to a drizzle, but Jess didn't waste any time. She grabbed her phone and sprinted inside. The diner was nearly empty, just a bored-looking waitress behind the counter and a trucker nursing a cup of coffee at one of the booths. Jess slid into a seat near the window, her hands still trembling. She ordered a coffee, hoping the warmth would steady her nerves. As she sat there, trying to convince herself that she'd imagined everything, her phone buzzed again. She picked it up, her stomach sinking when she saw a new notification. It wasn't a weather alert this time. It was a missed call from her own number. The timestamp was from 10 minutes ago. Her hand shook as she opened the call log. The number was hers, but it wasn't possible. She hadn't made any calls. Her heart raced as she stared at the screen, her mind struggling to make sense of it. And then, reflected in the dark glass of the diner window, she saw movement behind her. Story the end.
Story number 6.
It was a moonless night, and the stretch of road that cut through the dense pine forest seemed endless. Allison hated driving through these back roads alone, but work had kept her late, and the shortcut was the only way to shave off an hour from her trip home. She glanced at the clock on her dashboard, 11:27 p.m. If she kept up her speed, she'd be home by 12:15. The road was eerily quiet, her car the only sign of life in the oppressive darkness. The tall trees on either side loomed like silent watchers, their branches casting skeletal shadows across the asphalt whenever her headlights caught them. The faint sound of static hummed from her old car radio, the signal lost hours ago. She turned it off, preferring the quiet over the constant hiss. About 20 minutes into the drive, Allison saw a flicker of light up ahead. At first, she thought it was another car, but as she got closer, she realized it was stationary, a dim, flickering glow just off the road. As she rounded the bend, her headlights revealed the source, an old, beat-up sedan with its hazard lights blinking weakly. The car was pulled over onto the shoulder, its hood open. A figure stood beside it, waving their arms frantically. Allison slowed, her heart thudding. She had heard the warnings about stopping for strangers on deserted roads at night. Her mom's voice echoed in her head, "Just keep driving, you don't know what people are capable of." But as she got closer, she could see it was a woman. She looked to be in her late 30s, her face pale and anxious under the orange glow of the hazard lights. Her clothes were soaked, and she was shivering in the cold night air. Allison hesitated, her foot hovering over the brake pedal. The woman's eyes locked onto hers as Allison's car rolled closer. There was desperation in her gaze. "Please," the woman shouted, her voice barely audible over the hum of Allison's engine. Allison sighed and pulled over a few feet ahead. She cracked her window just enough to hear the woman. "Are you okay?" Allison asked cautiously. The woman hurried up to the car, her soaked sneakers squelching on the pavement. "Thank you for stopping," she said, her breath coming in short gasps. "My car won't start, and there's no service out here. Can you give me a ride to the nearest gas station?" Allison hesitated. The nearest gas station was at least 15 miles back, and the thought of letting a stranger into her car made her stomach twist. But the woman's eyes were pleading and her lips were trembling from the cold. "All right," Allison said finally. "Get in." The woman's face lit up with relief as she opened the passenger door and climbed in. She was clutching a small purse, her hands shaking. "Thank you," she said again. "I've been stuck out here for hours. I thought no one was going to stop." Allison nodded, but didn't respond. She pulled back onto the road, her hands gripping the wheel a little tighter than usual. "I'm Hannah," the woman said after a moment, her voice still shaky. "Allison," she replied, glancing at her passenger. Hannah was staring straight ahead, her hands clutching her purse tightly. Water dripped from her soaked hair onto her lap, forming a small puddle on the seat. "You're lucky I came by," Allison said, trying to break the tension. "This road doesn't see much traffic at night." Hannah nodded, but she didn't say anything. They drove in silence for a few minutes, the hum of the engine and the steady rhythm of the wipers, the only sounds. The farther they went, the more uneasy Allison felt. Hannah's posture was stiff, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. She hadn't asked where they were going, and she hadn't said a word since introducing herself. "So, where were you headed?" Allison asked, trying to sound casual. Hannah hesitated before answering. "Home," she said simply. "Where's home?" "Not far," Hannah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Allison frowned. If Hannah lived nearby, why was she asking to be taken to a gas station so far back? The question lingered in her mind, but she didn't press. A few miles later, the car began to feel colder. Allison reached for the heater dial and turned it up, but the air blowing from the vents was still icy. She glanced at Hannah, who was shivering in her seat. "Are you all right?" Allison asked. Hannah didn't respond. She was staring out the passenger side window, her face pale and expressionless. Allison's unease grew. She tightened her grip on the wheel, her eyes flicking between the road and her passenger. Something about Hannah felt wrong. Suddenly, Hannah spoke, her voice flat. "You should slow down." Allison frowned. The road ahead was empty, and she wasn't going more than 50. "Why?" Hannah turned to her, her eyes dark and unreadable. "There's a curve ahead. It's sharp." Allison's skin prickled. She hadn't mentioned anything about a curve, and her GPS didn't show one coming up. But as she rounded the next bend, her headlights illuminated the edge of a steep drop-off. The road curved sharply to the left with no guardrails to stop a car from going over. Her heart jumped, and she hit the brakes, taking the turn carefully. As the car straightened out, she glanced at Hannah. "How did you know about that?" Hannah didn't answer. She was staring straight ahead again, her expression blank. Allison's nerves were fraying. The car was freezing, and no amount of adjusting the heater seemed to help. She glanced at her phone, but the signal was still dead. She needed to get back to the highway, fast. A few minutes later, Hannah spoke again. "There's someone up ahead." Allison's eyes snapped to the road, her heart racing. At first, she didn't see anything, but then her headlights caught a figure standing on the shoulder. It was a man, his back to the road, his head hanging low. He was dressed in dark clothing and his hands were at his sides. Allison's stomach churned. "What the hell is he doing out here?" she muttered. As they passed the man, Allison turned to get a better look. But he wasn't there. The shoulder was empty. Her heart leapt into her throat. She slammed on the brakes, the car skidding slightly on the wet road. "What's wrong?" Hannah asked, her voice calm. "There was someone back there," Allison said, her voice shaking. "I saw him." Hannah tilted her head. "There's no one there." Allison turned to her, her skin crawling. "What's going on? Who are you?" Hannah didn't respond. She just stared at Allison, her eyes unblinking. Panic surged through Allison. She slammed her foot on the gas, the car lurching forward. She didn't care about the road or the rain. She just needed to get away from Hannah, from whatever this was. The temperature in the car dropped even further, and the air felt thick, suffocating. Allison's breath came out in visible puffs, her hands shaking on the wheel. And then the radio crackled to life. A low, distorted voice filled the cabin, whispering words Allison couldn't understand. She reached for the knob to turn it off, but the voice grew louder, more insistent. "Help me!" Allison's blood ran cold. She glanced at Hannah, but the passenger seat was empty. The car swerved as Allison jerked the wheel in shock. She slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car came to a halt in the middle of the road. Her heart was pounding, her breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. She looked around, but the road was empty. No Hannah. No car. No man on the shoulder. Her phone buzzed in the cup holder, the screen lighting up with a single notification. No signal. Allison stared at it, her hands trembling. She didn't know how long she sat there before she finally started the car and drove away, her eyes darting to the passenger seat every few seconds. When she finally reached the highway, the warmth returned and the oppressive air lifted. But Allison couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. She kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Hannah's pale face staring back at her. And for the rest of the drive home, she swore she could hear faint whispers buried beneath the hum of the engine.
Story number 7.
The storm rolled in faster than expected, and by the time Daniel left the office, the streets were glistening under the downpour. The autumn wind howled as he slid into his car, shaking off water from his coat. His drive home usually took about 40 minutes, but tonight, with the weather, he figured it might take longer. He had a route he always followed, a straight shot through the main roads, but tonight his GPS pinged with a detour. "Accident ahead," the robotic voice informed him. He sighed, already frustrated, and followed the new directions. The detour led him onto a back road he didn't recognize. The road was narrow, flanked by dense woods. The rain hammered down harder, and his wipers worked furiously to keep the windshield clear. The streetlights were sparse, and soon there were none at all. His headlights illuminated the road ahead, but only just. It felt as though the darkness here was thicker, heavier, pressing against his car. As he rounded a bend, something darted across the road. Daniel slammed on the brakes, the car skidding slightly before stopping. His heart raced as he scanned the road for whatever it was. A deer? A dog? He couldn't be sure. But then, just at the edge of his headlights, he saw her. A woman stood on the side of the road, drenched, her long dark hair plastered to her face. She wore a simple dress, pale and clinging to her body from the rain. She wasn't looking at him. Her head was tilted down, her face obscured. Daniel hesitated. She was clearly in distress, but something about the way she stood, motionless, almost unnatural, made him pause. He rolled down his window just slightly. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" He called out, his voice shaky. She didn't respond. Slowly, she lifted her head, and Daniel felt his stomach drop. Her eyes were wide, hollow, and her face was unnervingly pale. She stared at him without blinking. A chill ran through him, and he instinctively rolled the window back up. His gut screamed at him to drive, to leave, but his conscience held him in place. What if she was hurt? What if she needed help? He reached for his phone to call for assistance, but when he looked back up, she was gone. Daniel's breath caught. He scanned the road and the woods on either side, but there was no sign of her, just the rain and the oppressive darkness. Swallowing hard, he pressed on, his knuckles white as he gripped the wheel. The road seemed to stretch endlessly, the rain muffling all other sounds. He tried to shake off the encounter, telling himself the woman had likely wandered back into the woods. Maybe she lived nearby. Maybe he'd imagined the eeriness in her expression. But a few miles later, he saw her again. This time, she was standing in the middle of the road. Daniel slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding. The woman didn't move, didn't even flinch at the sound of screeching tires. He honked the horn, but she remained still, her lifeless eyes locked on him. "Jesus," he muttered, panic creeping into his voice. He didn't know what else to do. Slowly, he began to inch the car forward, hoping she would step aside. But as the car drew closer, she vanished. Not into the woods, not behind the car. She simply disappeared. Daniel's chest heaved as he stared at the empty road ahead. His hands trembled on the wheel. The urge to turn around and head back the way he came was overwhelming, but something told him he wouldn't make it far. He pressed on. The rain began to let up as he reached a small bridge spanning a narrow creek. His headlights flickered, just for a moment, and he cursed under his breath. The road was so isolated, so quiet now that the storm was easing. But the silence felt wrong. As he crossed the bridge, his radio crackled to life, despite him having turned it off earlier. Static filled the car, interspersed with faint whispers. He leaned forward, trying to make out the words, but they were garbled, unintelligible. Then, amid the static, he heard it. A woman's voice, soft and clear. "Help me." Daniel's blood ran cold. He fumbled with the radio, trying to turn it off, but the voice persisted, growing louder, more desperate. "Help me, please." "Shut up." he shouted, slamming his fist against the dashboard. The radio went silent. He exhaled shakily, his pulse racing. That's when he saw her again. She was standing on the other side of the bridge, directly in his path. Her head was tilted to the side, her arms hanging limply at her sides. "No," Daniel whispered, shaking his head. "This isn't real." He blinked and she was gone. The car's engine sputtered, the headlights dimming briefly before returning to full strength. Daniel pressed the gas pedal, desperate to get off the bridge, to get off this road. Finally, he saw a sign ahead. Mapleton, 5 miles. Relief flooded him. He wasn't far from civilization. But just as he began to relax, a heavy weight settled in the passenger seat beside him. Daniel's head snapped to the side and his breath caught in his throat. She was there. The woman. She sat stiffly, her wet hair dripping onto the seat, her lifeless eyes fixed straight ahead. Slowly, her head turned toward him, her lips parting as if to speak. Daniel screamed, swerving wildly. The car skidded off the road, slamming into a tree. When he came to, the car was silent, the rain reduced to a light drizzle. Pain throbbed in his chest where the seatbelt had caught him. He looked to the passenger seat. It was empty. The woman was gone. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, a truck coming down the road. Daniel stumbled out of the car, waving his arms to flag it down. The driver, an older man, stopped and got out, rushing over. "Are you all right? What happened?" Daniel struggled to find the words. "There was a woman. She was in my car." The man's face darkened. "You saw her, didn't you?" Daniel froze. The man nodded grimly. "You're not the first. She's been haunting this road for decades. Died here in a car crash long time ago. They say she shows herself to drivers, especially in the rain. Some say she's looking for someone to take her home." Daniel's knees buckled, and the man caught him, guiding him to the truck. As they drove toward town, Daniel glanced in the side mirror. For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw her standing in the distance, her pale figure illuminated by the truck's taillights. But when he blinked, she was gone. Story the end.
Story number 8.
The clock on Sarah's dashboard read 11:47 p.m. as she merged onto the empty highway. She had left her friend's wedding reception a little later than planned, and now she was paying the price for it. The long 2-hour drive back to her small town felt daunting. Still, she figured she could make it home before 2 a.m. if she kept her foot steady on the gas. The air was thick with the fog that seemed to creep out of nowhere in rural Ohio. Her high beams barely cut through it, casting long shadows that swayed and flickered as the trees lined the road like towering, dark sentinels. Sarah wasn't a fan of night drives, but she had done this before. "Just another road trip," she muttered to herself, gripping the wheel tighter. After about 30 minutes, the road transitioned from the smooth pavement of the interstate to a narrower, older back road she vaguely recognized from her GPS. She had taken this shortcut once before and remembered it shaved about 10 minutes off her drive. Though the lack of streetlights made the road feel unnerving, she reasoned that it was better than the monotony of the highway. The first half of the detour was uneventful. A straight stretch of road, the occasional bump from uneven asphalt, and the soft hum of her car's engine. But as she approached a curve near an old, dilapidated bridge, her headlights caught something on the side of the road. A car pulled off to the shoulder, its hazard lights blinking weakly. Slowing down, Sarah squinted to get a better look. The vehicle was old, maybe from the 80s, with rusted edges and a dark green paint job dulled by time. She glanced at her phone, which was mounted on the dash. No signal. Typical. As she inched closer, her stomach turned. A man was standing beside the car. He was tall, his shoulders hunched as he waved one arm, signaling her to stop. His other hand clutched a phone, which he shook as though frustrated. Sarah's instinct was to keep driving, but guilt tugged at her. He looked genuinely stranded. What if it were her, stuck on a desolate road with no cell service in the dead of night? She hesitated, then rolled down her window slightly as she pulled up beside him. "Need some help?" she asked cautiously. The man's face was partially obscured by the shadow of his baseball cap, but his voice carried a wariness that matched his disheveled appearance. "Yeah. My car died and I can't get a signal. Can you call someone for me when you're in range?" Sarah considered this. It seemed like an easy enough favor. No need to let a stranger into her car. "Sure," she replied. "I'll call once I get a signal. Where should I tell them you are?" The man pointed to the bridge behind him. Hollow Creek Bridge, just past the mile marker. Thanks. I appreciate it. No problem, Sarah said, already inching her car forward. She gave him a small wave as she drove off, relieved to be on her way. But as she crossed the bridge, something felt wrong. The air inside her car grew colder, and her headlights flickered briefly. She adjusted the heater, thinking nothing of it, and pressed on. She glanced at her rearview mirror and froze. The man was still standing by his car, but now he wasn't alone. A figure, a woman, was standing beside him. Sarah blinked, her pulse quickening. Had she missed someone earlier? The woman wore a pale, tattered dress, and her long, dark hair hung limply over her shoulders. She wasn't moving, wasn't speaking, just standing there, unnaturally still. A chill ran down Sarah's spine, and she forced herself to look away. She didn't want to linger on the image. People always said your eyes could play tricks on you in the fog. She drove on, but the uneasy feeling stayed with her. The road seemed darker now, the trees closer, their branches stretching overhead like skeletal arms. Her GPS beeped as it recalculated, briefly flickering before going blank. She cursed under her breath and kept driving, hoping she'd find a landmark soon. It wasn't long before she saw headlights in the distance. A car was coming toward her, its lights bright against the dark road. As it approached, she instinctively slowed down, relieved to see another traveler. But as the car passed, something caught her attention. It was the same dark green, rusted vehicle she had seen earlier. The man's car. Her chest tightened. That wasn't possible. She had just left him miles back. She craned her neck to look at the driver, but the car sped past too quickly. All she caught was a fleeting glimpse of a figure in the passenger seat, someone with long, dark hair. Sarah's foot pressed harder on the gas pedal, her heart pounding. It had to be a coincidence. There were plenty of old cars in the area. Maybe it wasn't even the same model. The road stretched on, and the fog thickened. She couldn't shake the sensation that she wasn't alone. Every so often she thought she saw movement in the trees, a shadow darting between the trunks, a flicker of white that disappeared as quickly as it appeared. Her hands trembled on the wheel. "Get it together," she whispered to herself. "It's just a creepy road. You'll be home soon." But then she saw the car again. It was parked on the side of the road, hazard lights blinking weakly. The same car, the same man standing beside it. This time, the woman was closer to him, her face turned slightly toward the road. Sarah slammed on the brakes, her tires skidding on the wet asphalt. She stared in disbelief. The man didn't react to her sudden stop. He just stood there, motionless, as if he hadn't moved since she'd last seen him. "What the hell?" she muttered, her breath fogging up the window. She reached for her phone, but the screen was still blank, no signal. Her headlights illuminated the scene before her, and she noticed something she hadn't seen earlier. The woman's feet weren't touching the ground. She hovered just slightly above it, her dress swaying in a breeze Sarah couldn't feel. The man suddenly turned his head toward her, his face obscured by shadow. Sarah's instincts screamed at her to drive, but her body felt frozen. Then, the woman's head snapped toward her, and Sarah's stomach dropped. Her eyes were empty, hollow black pits that seemed to suck the light from the car. Sarah screamed and hit the gas, her tires spinning before catching traction. She sped down the road, her pulse pounding in her ears. The road blurred around her, the trees merging into dark, indistinct shapes. She didn't dare look back. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. Her chest heaved as she tried to calm her breathing. She told herself she was safe now. She was far from the bridge, far from whatever that was. But the relief was short-lived. The cold returned, seeping into the car despite the heater blasting at full force. Her headlights flickered, and the engine made a sputtering noise that sent panic through her. "No, no, no," she begged, gripping the wheel tighter. The radio crackled to life, though she hadn't turned it on. Static filled the car, followed by faint whispers. Sarah's blood ran cold as a woman's voice broke through the noise. "Why didn't you stop?" Sarah's vision blurred with tears as she screamed, "Leave me alone." She slammed the dashboard, trying to shut off the radio, but the voice continued. "You can't leave. Not yet." The car suddenly jerked to the side as if something had struck it. Sarah fought to keep control, her knuckles white as she gripped the wheel. Her headlights caught a glimpse of something ahead, a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was the woman. She was closer now, her face pale and twisted into a grotesque grin. Sarah swerved to avoid her, the car skidding violently before coming to a halt. For a moment, everything was silent. The fog pressed against the windows and the shadows seemed to close in. And then she heard it, a faint tapping on her window. Sarah's breath hitched. She turned her head slowly, her body trembling. The woman's face was inches from the glass, her hollow eyes staring directly into Sarah's soul. The tapping grew louder, more frantic. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut and screamed, her hands slamming on the horn. When she opened her eyes again, the woman was gone. The car roared to life as Sarah floored the gas, her tires kicking up gravel as she tore down the road. She didn't stop, didn't look back, not even when she finally reached the safety of her driveway hours later. Sarah never took that shortcut again, and though she told herself it was over, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was still being watched.
Story number 9.
The rain had just started as Peter set out on the long drive home. He hated driving in the rain at night, especially on the isolated back roads that cut through the endless farmland and forests of his rural town. But tonight, he had no choice. The 2-lane highway he normally took had been shut down for construction, forcing him to take the detour through Hollow Creek Road, a route he hadn't driven in years. It was nearing midnight. And Peter's car was the only one on the road. The rain came down in sheets, his windshield wipers working furiously to keep up. He leaned forward, squinting against the glare of his headlights on the wet asphalt. The radio was off, the silence in the car thick and heavy, except for the rhythmic slap of the wipers. He was about 20 minutes into the drive when he first noticed it, a faint light in the distance. At first, he thought it might be another car coming from the opposite direction, but as he got closer, the light seemed stationary. It hovered just off the side of the road near a bend ahead. As he rounded the corner, his headlights illuminated the source. A car was parked on the shoulder, its hazard lights blinking weakly. It was an older model, maybe from the late 70s, with rust eating away at its fenders. The hood was up and a figure stood beside it, waving an arm. Peter slowed down instinctively, his hands tightening on the wheel. It was a man, maybe in his 40s, wearing a soaked flannel shirt and jeans. His face was partially obscured by the rain, but his posture radiated urgency. Peter's first instinct was to keep driving. Stopping for strangers on an empty road at night wasn't something he normally did. But as he passed the car, he caught a glimpse of the man's expression. His face was pale, his eyes wide with what looked like fear. He mouthed something, but Peter couldn't hear him over the rain. Peter sighed and pulled over a few yards ahead. He rolled down his window just enough to speak, letting in the cold, damp air. "You okay?" he called out. The man jogged up to the car, his boots splashing in the puddles. "Thank you for stopping," he said, his voice shaky. "My car broke down and I can't get it started. There's no cell service out here. Can you give me a ride to the nearest gas station?" Peter hesitated, glancing around. The road was dark and deserted, the trees lining it like silent sentinels. He didn't see anyone else. Against his better judgment, he nodded. "All right, get in." The man hurried around to the passenger side, opening the door and sliding in. He was dripping wet, water pooling on the seat beneath him. "Thank you," he said again, running a hand through his wet hair. "I've been out here for almost an hour. You're the first car to come by." Peter gave him a tight smile and put the car in drive. "No problem. There's a gas station about 10 miles ahead." The man nodded, but said nothing. They drove in silence for a few minutes, the rain continuing to hammer against the car. Peter glanced at his passenger out of the corner of his eye. The man was staring straight ahead, his hands clenched into fists on his lap. His face was pale, his lips pressed into a thin line. "You from around here?" Peter asked, trying to make conversation. The man shook his head. "No, just passing through." Peter nodded, focusing on the road. The trees seemed to press closer, their branches arching over the road like bony fingers. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was the way the man was sitting, so tense and quiet, or maybe it was the way the air inside the car felt colder, almost clammy. "Your car looks pretty old," Peter said, hoping to ease the tension. "How long have you had it?" The man didn't respond right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "It's not my car." Peter frowned. "What do you mean?" The man turned to him, his eyes dark and unreadable. "I borrowed it." Peter didn't like the way he said that. His grip on the wheel tightened. Borrowed it from who? The man didn't answer. Instead, he turned back to the window, staring out into the rain. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Peter's unease grew with every passing mile. He glanced at his phone mounted on the dashboard. Still no signal. The gas station couldn't be much farther, but the drive felt endless. And then he saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by his headlights. Peter slammed on the brakes, the car skidding slightly on the wet asphalt. The man beside him didn't react, didn't even flinch. Peter stared at the figure ahead, his heart pounding. It was a woman. She wore a long, white dress that clung to her body, soaked through by the rain. Her hair was dark and hung limply around her face, obscuring her features. She wasn't moving. "What the hell?" Peter whispered. The man beside him finally spoke, his voice flat. "Don't stop." Peter turned to him, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean? She's standing in the road." "Just go around her," the man said, his tone icy. "Don't stop the car." Peter hesitated, his foot hovering over the gas pedal. The woman hadn't moved. She just stood there, motionless, her head tilted slightly as if watching them. And then slowly she began to raise her arm. She pointed directly at the car. Peter's blood ran cold. Without another word, he swerved around her, his tires splashing through the puddles. He didn't look back. "Who was that?" Peter demanded, his voice shaking. "Do you know her?" The man didn't answer loud. He was staring straight ahead again, his expression unreadable. The rest of the drive passed in tense silence. When the gas station finally came into view, Peter let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The fluorescent lights flickered in the rain, casting an eerie glow over the empty lot. Peter pulled into a parking space and turned to the man. "This is as far as I'm going." The man nodded and opened the door. But before he got out, he turned back to Peter. His eyes were dark, almost black, and his face was eerily calm. "You shouldn't have stopped," he said. Peter's stomach twisted. "What are you talking about?" The man didn't answer. He stepped out of the car and shut the door. Peter watched as he walked toward the gas station, his figure disappearing into the rain. Peter sat there for a moment, trying to calm his racing heart. He glanced at the passenger seat where the man had been sitting. The fabric was soaked, but something else caught his eye. A dark, reddish stain was smeared across the seat and floor. His chest tightened. He turned to look toward the gas station, but the man was gone. The lot was empty. Peter didn't wait to figure out what had just happened. He threw the car into reverse and sped out of the lot, his hands trembling on the wheel. The rain seemed to grow heavier, the road darker, but he didn't stop. He didn't look back. It wasn't until he got home that he realized his phone had been recording audio the entire time. He hadn't meant to turn it on, but there it was, sitting in the center console with the recording app running. With shaking hands, he played it back. The first few minutes were unremarkable. The sound of rain, the hum of the engine. But then, faintly, he heard it. A woman's voice, whispering, "Turn back."
Story number 10.
It was a little after 11 p.m., and the road stretched out in front of Alex like a dark ribbon cutting through endless farmland. He had been driving for hours, the glow of his dashboard casting faint green light across his tired face. The plan was simple: drive through the night to get back home in time for his sister's birthday. He had done long-haul drives before, but something about this stretch of road felt off. The GPS on his phone glitched periodically, freezing, recalculating, and then flashing back to life. It wasn't a big deal. Alex had been down this highway before, and the route was straightforward. Still, the strange pauses in the GPS felt unsettling in the otherwise silent cabin of the car. The only sound was the faint hum of the tires on the asphalt and the occasional buzz of a late-night radio host talking about conspiracy theories. After nearly 2 hours of not seeing another vehicle, Alex noticed a dim light on the side of the road in the distance. As he got closer, he realized it was a car pulled over on the shoulder. Its hazard lights blinked weakly, casting faint amber glows against the surrounding darkness. Slowing down, Alex scanned for signs of someone outside the car. At first, he didn't see anyone, but then just ahead of the vehicle, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a woman, her silhouette outlined faintly by the blinking lights. She was standing still, facing the road, her arms crossed over her chest as if trying to keep warm. Alex hesitated. Everything in him told him to keep driving. It was late, and he didn't want to risk trouble. But then he thought of his sister. What if she were stranded in the middle of nowhere? He sighed and slowed his car to a stop a few feet ahead of the woman's vehicle. He rolled his window down just a little. "Hey, everything all right?" The woman stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate. She looked to be in her early 30s, with long, dark hair hanging loosely over her shoulders. Her face was pale, almost unnaturally so, and she was dressed in an old-fashioned gray coat that seemed out of place in the modern world. "My car broke down," she said softly. Her voice was steady, calm, but something about it didn't sit right with Alex. It was almost too calm. "Do you need me to call someone for you?" he asked, glancing uneasily at her car. "No signal out here?" she replied, her gaze unwavering. "I just need a ride to the next town." Alex's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He glanced at his phone. No bars. She was right. "All right," he said reluctantly. "Hop in, but just to the next town." The woman nodded and climbed into the passenger seat without another word. She closed the door gently and sat very still, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Alex started driving, stacked the tension in the car thick enough to cut with a knife. "Where exactly do you need to go?" he asked, trying to break the silence. "Just down the road," she said, her voice flat. Alex glanced at her from the corner of his eye. She didn't look at him or the dashboard, just stared straight ahead. Her pale face reflected faintly in the windshield, and for a moment Alex thought he saw something flicker in her expression, something cold, almost empty. He shook the thought from his head and focused on the road. The silence grew heavier, broken only by the occasional creak of the car's suspension as it rolled over small bumps in the road. "Were you coming from a party or something?" Alex asked, forcing a casual tone. The woman didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her words sent a chill down his spine. "I was coming home." There was something in the way she said it that made Alex uneasy. He glanced at the GPS on his phone. It was frozen again, the map locked on a blank screen. "Okay," he muttered, trying to keep his nerves in check. The road ahead seemed darker now, the trees on either side looming closer. The air in the car felt colder, and Alex turned the heat up, but it didn't seem to help. He stole another glance at the woman, and his stomach twisted. She was staring at him now, her eyes wide and unblinking. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Do you believe in ghosts?" she asked, her tone as calm as ever. The question caught him off guard. Not really." "Why?" She didn't respond. Instead, she turned her gaze back to the road, her expression unreadable. Alex's heart pounded. He gripped the wheel tighter, focusing on the faint yellow lines guiding him forward. The silence stretched on, oppressive and suffocating. Then, out of nowhere, the woman spoke again. "They never stop, you know." Alex frowned. "What?" "The people who pass by. They never stop. You're the first one who has." A cold shiver ran down his spine. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer, and when Alex glanced at her again, his blood ran cold. She wasn't there. The passenger seat was empty. Alex slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop in the middle of the road. His breathing was ragged as he turned in his seat, searching the back seat and the road behind him. Nothing. His hands shook as he gripped the wheel, his mind racing. He couldn't explain what had just happened. Was he imagining things? Was he just overtired? He took a deep breath and tried to calm himself. Slowly, he put the car back into drive and started moving again. The road stretched on, dark and endless. But then, in the rearview mirror, he saw her. The woman was standing in the middle of the road behind him, her pale face glowing faintly in the darkness. Her eyes locked onto his, and her lips moved, though no sound came out. Alex's chest tightened as he floored the gas pedal. The car surged forward, the engine roaring as he sped away. He didn't dare look back, but he could feel her presence, lingering just beyond the edge of his headlights. Minutes later, he saw the lights of a gas station up ahead, the first sign of civilization he'd seen in hours. He pulled into the lot, his hands shaking as he parked and stumbled out of the car. The attendant, a middle-aged man with a weathered face, looked up from behind the counter. "You all right, buddy?" he asked. Alex nodded, though he knew he looked anything but fine. I think I picked up a hitchhiker back there, but she wasn't." The attendant's expression darkened. "Let me guess? Pale woman? Long dark hair? Old coat?" Alex froze. "Yeah," the man said, his voice grim. "You're not the first to see her. Just folks around here say she died out on that stretch of road decades ago. Car broke down and no one stopped for her. Now she waits out there, hoping someone will. Alex's stomach churned. He glanced back at his car, half expecting to see her standing beside it. Does she ever hurt anyone? He asked hesitantly. The attendant shook his head. Not that I've heard, but I wouldn't test her patience if you know what I mean. Alex nodded slowly, the weight of the encounter settling heavily on him. He didn't know what he had seen or why it had happened, but one thing was certain. He would never forget that woman, or the way her empty eyes seemed to follow him even now. Story the end.
Story number 11.
It was late November, and the air was cold enough to bite. Lydia had been on the road for 3 hours already, returning home from a conference in a neighboring state. She had wanted to leave earlier, but the meeting had dragged on, and now it was past midnight. The highway was empty, stretching endlessly in front of her, its shoulders flanked by dense, leafless woods. Her headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but the occasional road sign or reflective marker. She fiddled with the radio, trying to find something to keep her alert, but all she could pick up was static and faint, distorted voices from distant AM stations. Her GPS announced in its mechanical tone, "Turn left onto Old Timber Road in 0.3 miles. Lydia frowned. She didn't remember putting in that route, but maybe it was recalculating to avoid construction or traffic. She shrugged it off and slowed as the narrow turnoff came into view. Old Timber Road was unlit, its cracked pavement barely visible. "Shortcut," she muttered, trying to reassure herself. The road was tight and winding, with sharp turns that seemed to come out of nowhere. The trees were closer now, their branches hanging low over the road like skeletal arms reaching out to grab her car. Lydia's chest tightened. She told herself it was just the isolation that made her uneasy. She hadn't seen another car in nearly an hour, and the silence outside her vehicle was absolute. No wind, no rustling leaves, just her engine humming and the faint squeak of her windshield wipers. Half an hour in, she spotted something on the side of the road ahead. As her car approached, her stomach sank. It was a figure standing just at the edge of her high beam's range. It was a man wearing what looked like a dark jacket and jeans. His face was shadowed, and he stood completely still, facing the road. Lydia slowed instinctively, her pulse quickening. As her car drew closer, she gripped the steering wheel tightly, debating whether to stop. Her better judgment screamed no, but what if he needed help? The highway was too far away, and she couldn't just leave someone stranded. Rolling down her window a crack, she leaned slightly out and called, "Hey, you okay?" The man didn't move. Lydia felt a cold knot form in her stomach. The headlights illuminated him fully now. His clothes were torn, dirty, and his hands hung limply at his sides. Something about him felt wrong. She couldn't put her finger on it, but every instinct told her to get away. "Do you need help?" she called again, louder this time. Slowly, the man tilted his head, his neck moving in an unnatural jerky motion. Lydia gasped and slammed her foot on the gas. Her car roared past him, the tires kicking up loose gravel as she sped away. Her heart thundered in her chest as she glanced in the rearview mirror. The man was still standing there, but as she watched, he stepped into the middle of the road, facing her departing car. She couldn't shake the image of him, his eerie stillness, the way his head moved like a broken puppet. She checked her phone for a signal but found none. The GPS seemed to glitch, the route ahead marked only by a straight, unchanging line. Minutes passed and she tried to calm herself, telling herself it was just a weird encounter. Maybe he was drunk or homeless. But as the road stretched on, her unease grew. The trees seemed denser, their branches intertwining above her like a canopy. The darkness between them felt alive, as if something was watching her. Then she saw it, a flash of movement on the side of the road ahead. Her hands tightened on the wheel. "No, no, no," she whispered. It was the man again, standing in the same spot as before, as if she had never passed him. His figure was unmistakable, same torn jacket, same slack arms, her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't possible. She hadn't turned around, hadn't made any detours. This time, she didn't slow down. She pressed the gas pedal to the floor and sped past him without a glance, her car shuddering as it hit a small bump in the road. She didn't dare look back, but she didn't have to. She heard it, a low, guttural voice, faint but clear, coming from the back seat. Why didn't you stop? Lydia screamed, swerving the car violently. The wheels skidded on the icy pavement, and she barely managed to regain control. She glanced in the rearview mirror, her stomach twisting in terror. The back seat was empty. Her breathing was shallow, her chest tight as she pushed the car harder. The road seemed endless, the trees an impenetrable wall of darkness on either side. She checked the clock on the dashboard. It was stuck at 12:17, the glowing numbers flickering faintly. The radio crackled, and then the static gave way to a faint voice. Turn around. She jabbed the power button, silencing it, but the voice lingered in her mind. Turn around, before it's too late. Her knuckles were white as she gripped the steering wheel. She didn't know what was happening, but she couldn't stay on this road. Her eyes scanned the edges of the forest, searching for any sign of a crossroad, a driveway, anything that could lead her back to the highway. And then, as if answering her desperate prayers, she saw lights ahead. 2 small pinpricks, glowing in the distance. Another car. Relief flooded her chest as she honked her horn and flashed her high beams. The approaching vehicle slowed, and as it drew closer, Lydia rolled down her window. It was an old pickup truck, the kind you'd expect to see on a farm. The driver, an older man with a weathered face and a thick flannel jacket, leaned out his window. You lost, miss? He asked, his voice gravelly but kind. Yes, Lydia said, her voice trembling. I need to get back to the highway. This road doesn't feel right. The man's expression darkened. You shouldn't be here, he said, his tone grim. This road, it's not for travelers. What do you mean? She asked, her pulse quickening. He shook his head. Turn around. Go back the way you came, and whatever you do, don't stop again. Before she could respond, the man drove off, his taillights vanishing into the darkness. Lydia sat frozen, her mind racing. She turned her car around, her headlights sweeping across the woods. The road back felt different, the turns sharper, the darkness deeper. She drove as fast as she dared, her hands shaking on the wheel. And then she saw him again. The man in the torn jacket stood in the middle of the road, his head tilted, his empty eyes glowing faintly in her headlights. Lydia's breath caught in her throat as he raised a hand, pointing directly at her. Why didn't you stop? His voice echoed, not from his mouth, but from everywhere at once. She screamed and slammed on the gas, her car barreling toward him. But just as she was about to hit him, he vanished. Her car skidded to a stop, and Lydia sobbed, her whole body trembling. She looked around, but the road was empty. When she finally made it back to the highway, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. She pulled into a gas station and collapsed onto the steering wheel, tears streaming down her face. The attendant tapped on her window, and she rolled it down shakily. You okay, miss? He asked, concern etched on his face. I don't know, she whispered. There was a man, and the road, it wasn't. The attendant frowned. Old Timber Road? Lydia nodded. You're not the first, he said quietly. People say that road's haunted. A man died out there years ago, hit by a car while he was hitchhiking. They say he's still out there looking for someone to stop for him. Lydia stared at him, her hands trembling. She never drove that route again. Story the end.